Kiara Koto Katawa, welcome to CARE's Academic in Residence series. I want to begin by acknowledging the ancestors of Rangitane. It is also a reminder that we stand on indigenous ground, and the decolonization process doesn't really even begin to occur till we start conversations and activist movements on returning indigenous land. Conversations on land back are vital to decolonization struggles. It is our pleasure to have with us today Professor Tanmoy Bhattacharya. Professor Bhattacharya is professor and head of the Department of Linguistics, University of Delhi. He is also a PhD in linguistics from the University of London and guides research on syntax, psycholinguistics, gender, disability, deaf education, and sign linguistics at the Department of Linguistics, University of Delhi. He has held research and academic positions at School of Oriental and African Studies, Universität Leipzig, University College London, MS University Baroda, and University of Hyderabad. He has been the member convener of an UGC Committee on Disability and Higher Education and the coordinator of the Equal Opportunity Cell, University of Delhi, where he has taught disability and human rights. He is currently the chairperson, Expert Committee on Development of Training Program on Indian Sign Language, Rehabilitation Council India. And it is this intersection of theory and praxis which makes it so exciting to be able to have a conversation with you, Tanmoy. He sits on several committees and is consulted regularly on inclusive education and Indian Sign Language. Within the field of disability, he specializes in disability studies, deaf education, and inclusive education. He's worked on exam policy and produced blueprints for equal opportunity cells and disability studies centers at universities for the UGC. He has over 87 journal articles, book chapters, and 4 books converge around these issues of disability, language, linguistics, rights. And this vast range of interests offer us openings for thinking about the interplays of voice, centering, decentering, and the politics of the margins. So it's a pleasure to have you with us, Tanmoy. Welcome.
Thank you, Mohan, for your introduction. I will also have an occasion to talk a little bit more about myself, just to remind you of my location when I begin the talk. I'm not beginning the talk. That's why my attributions are not there. This is what I call a rant, for want of a better term. It's a kind of invocation. It's an invocation. It's a prelude, a rant. It doesn't get done usually. What I'm going to present in next 8 to 12 slides, it doesn't get done. It should be ideally sung, maybe as a rap, but I'm not the right person to do that. It also happens to capture my philosophy of inclusion, which I call centering. I pronounce it as centering, but spell it differently, which you will see a little later. So let me begin the rant, and bear with me. In 2010, in an EPW paper, Economic and Political Weekly in India, very well read, I talked about a certain 3-pronged strategy for inclusion, one of which was, even if idealistic, push for inclusion in education. The idea of inclusion cannot be given up. So this is the beginning of the rant. If even the idea dies, there will be no revolution, however small. So I say that one way to tackle inclusion will be to break it down into smaller goals, the strategy of questioning categories. So first category I'm questioning here is knowledge. As a teacher, I could ask myself, what is knowledge? How is knowledge constructed? What are the dispositives that conspire to construct knowledge relations exerted by disciplinary authorities? In short, what is the genealogy of knowledge? One day we could sit down and contemplate and not teach a prescribed lesson on an established icon, and every country had their own favorite heroes, but somebody else. And this is the refrain. This is how a revolution begins, however small. Next category is textbooks. One could also look at textbooks and ask, who is it made for? Have we ever thought that books have human connections? Books are seen as instruments, not something organic, not something that can be an extension of the human. All of us have a favorite book, but none of us have a favorite textbook. I mean, rarely. Maybe somebody will have. Why? A school textbook is designed to keep the child away so that you cannot extend yourself into the book. It is meant to not become you. We could ask, why is book at the center of material world of teaching learning or a certain form of a book? We could replace it by a song, a film, a game, even if for a day. This is how a revolution begins, however small. Third category is student. I could ask, who is a student? That is, what is my definition of a student? Is the Dalit blind or tribal student a Dalit blind tribal student, quote unquote, a category separate from my students? That is how a category that is so obvious in an academician's life lends itself to re examination. This is how a revolution begins, however small. Now, the most important category, exams, at least from where I'm coming from. Before the child learns the word ghost, the child learns the word exam. The semantics of the network of that word contains fear, anxiety, loss, failure, and of course, more and more, suicide. Very true for India. The word is meant to forever change your psychology and take something away from your wellness of being permanently, something that is never repaired, never made up. One day we could decide to do away with exams, at least the usual kind. This is how a revolution begins, however small. Finally, classroom. One could also look around the classroom and ask if it encourages different ways of moving through space as valid. Are the posters, the charts, the signs, democratic ways of informing, advocating, counseling, warning? One day we could take a class on the ground floor or read out or sign the messages in the charts, posters. This is how a revolution begins, however small. That's the end of the rant. And this encapsulates in this form my idea of inclusion, which I'll have more occasions to talk about today. But let me begin the talk. And this, as you're familiar already with the title, Traditional Children's Games in India, Reviving and Renewing Pre-Colonial Inclusive Practices. There are certain words which need to be questioned, discussed, and talked about. And I will roughly go through some of them during the whole presentation, but not separately. And it's, of course, I'm open to questioning. Now, my location, as Mohan rightly pointed out, my primary identity, that's where I get my bread and butter from, is a linguist. Okay. And that too of a very technical Chomskyan generative linguistics that I practice and I do research with students. But I'm also deeply involved in the general idea of inclusion. And I, find this, as a, it's part of my personality. As a person, I'm interested in this general idea of inclusion. And my scholarship or my awareness of my own kind of linguistics and disability studies helped me to sharpen these ideas or this main idea. I work in disability, linguistics, and education, three main fields I work on. And as you saw, classroom, students, knowledge, etc. And if language is constitutive of human experience or human existence, then I find that these ideas inform each other. It's a bigger topic. I will only refer to it briefly. I've done a recent paper, which is just a transcription of a talk I gave in February on International Mother Language Day, 21st February, where I explored this bigger frame of multilinguality, where I basically say that multilinguality is not really about multiple languages. It's about our multiple being and becoming. So I call it multilingual becoming, but I'll come to that. The talk is based on this paper, which is going to come out very soon at the end of this year or early next year. It's a very important book. I think it's a uh, first major discussion of post-colonialism in relation to disability. So the title of the paper is the traditional children's games in India, unlearning the attributes of subordination, and it's going to come out in Routledge Handbook of Postcolonial Disability Studies, edited by Tsitsi Chitaika and Dan Goodley, very well-known scholars in disability studies. As I said, this is the first time I think post-colonialism as a book, as a handbook, been looked at. There are papers on this. Okay, so post-colonialism already ruffled the feathers by mentioning this word, and Mohan did too in his introduction. It's a fraught concept, right, and a contested term, mainly because I think it has a spine, and it has hit at the edifice at a location where it matters the most. So there have been attempts to deny it, there have been attempts to erase it, there have been attempts to rewrite it, and certainly there have been a lot of criticism of it. And diverse opinions within post-colonialism theory and practice hasn't helped the matter either. But it has not been dislodged because the theory itself, I think, accurately predicts its own predicament. Okay, so this quote unquote hatred for post colonialism is predicted by post colonialism. That's a great proof that it is there. That the uneasiness with post colonialism is because of the operation of post colonialism itself. So, what is it? So, I have culled a definition from relevant sources very briefly, generally, without getting into the detailed discussions of this. Post colonialism refers to the period and state of affairs of the aftermath of colonialism and highlights the struggles to reclaim and rethink the history and agency of people subjugated under some form of imperialism. These struggles are mainly political and economical, but in this paper, I'll take up something which is also cultural, where oppressed groups seek control over their language and history, and as I'll show, traditional games. So again, very generally, to get a first introduction to post-colonialism, it has two foundational aspects. One is theory, other is politics. The theory is broadly informed by post-structuralism, and the politics is broadly informed by, well, a generic Marxist philosophy, but I will refer to this as subalternity because I think the subaltern enters the politics of post-colonialism through this lens. So let's first look at theory, the post-structuralism. And within that, just to simplify things a bit, there are two aspects of post-structuralism, two things that are formative of post-structuralism is taken up here. One is questioning various kinds of things. I'll in fact show that the two kinds of things that opens themselves to questioning, and other is the cultural difference or cultural diversity or cultural alterity. So let's look at questioning. And again, there are two ways you can question. One is Western knowledge structures, the Western epistemological structures, which is the more familiar form of questioning. So you question broad themes and categories like justice, reason, man as opposed to woman, mind over body, and then already in this color, magenta color, able over disabled. But also you could question the disciplinary norms. This is something which is broadly coming out from disability studies research enterprise. You could question, for example, in science and medicine, the concept of a normative body, species typical body, right? For political science, you could question the normative of a normative citizen, because that's a basic assumption. Okay, you don't have political science of citizens who are considered to be not the normative. For law, you have the normative as reasonable man. Okay, so apart from these things in colored items like able, body, and reason, which are disability specific, there are two very disability specific topics I'll highlight. One is inclusion. This is my own work. It'll come in a bigger detail later on in the talk. And questioning disciplinary norms, I have worked on that also, which was kind of, you could guess from the introduction, that I have done through questioning this assumption that language studies, linguistics, is about spoken language. Not denying that there have been works for several years from 1960s onwards on sign language or other forms of language, but this is the norm, spoken language. So if you look at the terms in linguistics, for example, language standardization, right? Low variety, high variety, and you have this, let's say, grammar terms like tense, past, present, future, okay, agreement, and case studies, which we have a long history in ancient India onwards. We have this Karaka theory, case history. So these lose significance once you change the normative from spoken language to sign language. Okay, so I mean, tense, I don't have to have a marker of tense, past tense. I can just do this, that's past, right? I can do this, that is present, future. Long, much later, it goes in the height and this thing. So I'm using spatial visual language. So it's not, it loses that significance when you change the normative. So this is a paper in published in 2022 last year, and show that many central topics of linguistics lose their significance. Additionally, once you start looking at linguistics from the point of view of sign language, you come up or discover or certain other topics attain significance, which will change the way linguistics can be studied. For example, uh, we, we do a lot of study on language variation at different levels within English and within a certain variety of English, sub varieties of English, or any other language, and across languages, etc. But variation has always been studied from uh, what we call phonology and morphology, that is structure of words and little affixes with the words and the sounds, the phonology, phonetics. Again, that loses significance once you shift your base to sign language. There is no equivalent of sounds, right? And morphology is also debatable. So then, how do you study variation? So what I suggested is that you study variation through grammar differences, because that seems to be something which is doable in sign language, and that gives a different lens to study spoken language as well. So okay, so let me go back to the. So we have finished like one part, questioning, and let's look at this cultural alterity. And here I will again keep it brief at this moment, but this is one in yellow highlight. That is how I spell it, and I call it centering. The philosophy is centering, but this is how it is spelled. There are specific reasons for this. We can get into this during discussion. Okay, so there is a D, and there is a slash, and there is a capital C. Okay, so there is a disjunction between how it is to be written or spoken, and how it is to be written and how it is to be spoken. This is a brief definition, a process of continuous shifting continuous shifting of the center of knowledge making. I'll talk in more detail about this more later. And as I said at the beginning, the bigger framework informing this concept of centering is actually multilinguality. I don't want to go into detail from this quotation. This is the recent paper. You can concentrate on this multilingual becoming at the end of it. This is slightly outside this talk, so I won't go to it. But to give you a full vista of the things, I just refer to multilinguality here very briefly. Now, these two things, questioning categories and cultural alterity, already gives us a kind of epistemology, a knowledge system, which I'm calling as the Southern epistemology. And these four categories, questioning gives rise to new epistemology. Knowledge creation is based on four things. We need to remember this, as I'll come back to it: anti-coloniality, economic viability, sustainability, and importantly for this talk, flexibility. Okay, so I'll zero in on that flexibility concept when I come to traditional Indian games. So new knowledge arises through this continuous shifting of the center and the periphery. Okay, sorry, I think I should go back to where I was. Yeah. So already we have a kind of a conclusion just by looking at this very briefly at one aspect of the post-structuralism concept, namely questioning and cultural alterity. And this is what I call a significant sort of arrive at a significant conclusion. If we relocate, new knowledge will result both at the center and the periphery. This reminds us of actually the most well-known post-colonial, initiation into post-colonial theory was Fanon's idea, which was published in this French book in 1961 called The Wretched of the Earth, published as an English translation in 1963 for the first time, where he talks about the binary between the colonized and the colonizer and refers to it not in great detail, as both need to decolonize. The colonized decolonizes by overcoming imposition of rules on their territory, body, and mind. And the colonizer, he is not willing to spend too long on the colonizer. And he says the colonizer needs to decolonize by making sense of their brutality and humanism. Okay, so it's a kind of a psychological issue. So I'm not departing too much from Fanon, but I'm going to look at it after so many decades slightly differently. What I'm saying here is that at the center, we need to figure out how to restitute and redistribute. And at the periphery, we need to figure out how to overcome the feeling of disrobement. And as I'm saying, for both, new knowledge will appear, new epistemology will appear. So this continuous shifting from the center to the periphery, and as I was talking yesterday with Mohan, it's not as simple as center and periphery. There are semi-peripheral positions. There are positions between the center and the periphery. But there's a continuous shifting. So nobody stays at the center for too long, and new knowledge will appear. So therefore, if you go through this process, what I believe is that this whole notion of a center and other as non-center kind of gets subverted. Okay, so it stops being a big deal. So that's the idea. Okay, so now I come to the politics of post-colonialism, and I think with this I will end the theoretical aspect of it and so get into the games a little bit. And I consider subalternity enters post-colonialism through the political, and the main binary is dominant subaltern binary. And for very specific reasons, for the in the context of this talk, the more specific dyad is it should be other children and the disabled child. I, there is a mistake here. So it should be other children and the disabled child died. It's a social relation. You can have many kinds of social relation. One kind of social relation is a relation of an individual to a group. Okay, so this is the social relation I'm picking up. And if you do a qualitative interpretation of social relations of productions, then you get a qualitative relation of production. Okay, you don't get a force of production in this topic, but you do get a qualitative relation of production. So that makes us a Marxist from that point of view. And the second point, how subalternity enters, is very clear. And this I would like to spend a little longer. The transformation from games to sports. Okay, so we are talking about games when you're talking about traditional games, right? But uh, about 200 years ago, that concept of games changed to sports, where it became competitive, where winning mattered, where individual winning mattered. There is a person, a winner, who is the strongest in terms of lifting something, throwing something the farthest, jumping the highest, jumping the longest, okay, running the fastest. So this whole idea of change from games to sports already gives rise to feeds back to the dominant subaltern binary, because it gives rise to the dominant subaltern. Okay, and again, for a specific context, like my context here today, I will say it gives rise to a very specific binary, which is able, not able, right? So, yeah, and then you can look at, with this lens, the sports lens, we can look back at games, and we find that it is not really applicable. That's what the point of the talk is. Now, okay, one last point that I want to mention, which is related to what I'm going to say next, although it's not, I've not built it in post-colonialism yet, is an extension to the psychological, right? So condition of subordination is mostly concerned with the psychological, and I believe that we need to look at that. And there have been various psychological reinterpretation of the post-colonial, but I am not going to that domain. What I'm going to say, bring you to disability studies now. When disability enters, let's say, theory, it becomes disability studies, and there is, of course, politics. But when disability really enters into politics, it becomes disability activism. However, the psychology and disability, when disability enters the psychology, the phenomenology, the individual experiences, the theories have been shown to fail. The theories from 1970s, from UK or US, and in the 1990s from various other places, shown to fail when it comes to the individual, because the politics gets destabilized. However, I think it is important, and that's what people thought. Scholars, especially feminist disability scholars, came with this perspective that we cannot ignore the individual. It doesn't weaken our politics. We need to find a balance. So this is a quotation from a person I'll be talking about further on. I started walking at the age of 2.5 years. My impairment impacted my body balance. I used to fall down frequently, but it was never a big deal for me to get hurt. A cut on the body would make me feel good. I took it as a marker of being a fighter or a hero, right? And then same person also talks about this. If I fall, it becomes traumatic for the parents. They also get worried about injuries. Soon I started practicing falling not on the back of my head, but in the front. Okay, so this is Samir Chaturvedi, and I'll talk about him later on. But in the first quotation, I've highlighted this never a big deal, because I think it's a subversion of the social norms, the disciplinary norms. Parents tell you to sit straight, walk in a certain way. Teachers tell you to do this, and there's a classroom behavior. There's certain ways of behaving at the dinner table, etc. And it is destabilizes that whole disciplinary norm of saying that falling is not a big deal. No one's making a lot of noise about a child falling, because this has become the norm, right? It's a never big deal. It's a social thing, and this position, this thinking, this is a very honest sort of writing that Samir has done. It's a short, article, 6-7 pages, but he talked about his own experience as a person growing up with cerebral palsy, and so it became the norm. Falling became the norm. However, the psychology of anxiety, especially through parents' eyes, cannot be ignored. And once you have anxiety, I think the psychology enters your being. So how to decolonize? In order to decolonize, I think we need to identify these two conditions. One you're already familiar with. Condition one transformation from games to sports, and we decolonize by what I'm saying here, which is almost the title of the talk, and little vague, reviving and renewing the pre-colonial concept of games. At this point, I will show you a video. Please tell me. This is on. Okay. It's a short 1 minute video. This is a game called Coco. This is one team, and that's the chaser, the boy in yellow. And he can do this tagging, he can touch, and somebody else becomes chaser. They're chasing those three other children who have come from the other team. So it's like a team game. And it's a team game, and it's a, there's no attention paid to individual. I refer to this game before the other two videos I'll show later on, because very early on, last century, 1918, if I remember, it was demonstrated to be part of games in general. And then and very early on, again in 1932 Olympics, I believe, in Berlin, there was a demonstration of Coco to be recognized as a game. Of course, it didn't happen. Much later, in 1990s, it was recognized as a sport. It's a game within South Asian games, not even Asian games. So it is recognized to some extent. There are tournaments held, and this is one way of reviving a traditional game where actually the game flavor is retained. Second condition is model inclusion. Again, I'll have time to talk about this. And this is the new part, that decolonize by what I'm referring here as contextual integration. Let's look at what integration is. And there are four varieties of integration that are there in the literature. One is geographical integration, different units in the same campus without mixing. It's kind of a segregation, but within the same boundary. Periodic integration, which I'm going to rename as episodic, once each week for integration or integrational events, assembly or something like that. Then social integration, which I'm going to rename as periodic, share meals and playtime and assemblies. And then functional integration, which I'm going to rename as totalizing, taught in the same class. This becomes meaningless without inclusion, right? So I think you'll probably get the gist of what I'm saying when I come to a slide later on to show what inclusion is. So in all these ways, the school remains unchanged. The focus is on the child fitting in. As opposed to this, inclusion is not static, it's dynamic. It's a process that implies changes in the school ethos. It's a big word, to accept and value difference. Curriculum content rather than delivery must change. Now, my work on inclusion and my inspiration is this cytogenicist, Barbara McClintock. This is a photo, I think, much later in her life. She was 83 or something. And she got a very belated recognition as a scientist. She was looking at, as you can see, she's holding that maize corns, and she was looking at the chromosomal structure of maize. And after 30 years of her first paper or presentation that was done in 1951, it was only in 1981 the Time magazine acknowledged her and called her the modern Mendel. Of course, the reference is always to a man. And but in some ways she is similar to Mendel in her being a loner, and also very meticulous, and prided on took pride on every aspect of the experiments she would set up. It was not so easy to set up experiments, so she would work every day in the lab, and so planting the corn kernels, cultivating them, watering them, pollinating. Now you can do pollinating by machines, but there at that time you got to wait for pollination to take place, collecting kernels, labeling them, and then analyzing under preparing the microscopic slides, which have become very easy nowadays, and interpreting the results. And after this 1981 article in Time magazine, she was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1983 at the age of 81. Okay, and the work she did actually is the first work on genetic recombination, which was, but nobody actually knows much about her unless you're a biologist or you're in the sciences looking at very specific topics. Because I remember when I first mentioned this in a talk with the vice chancellor, who is I think from science that time, and the pro vice chancellor, the first and the second position hierarchically at the university, and other scientists were present, and they were not aware of her. But what I'm interested in, what she had said, there are many things that she said which applies directly to this idea of inclusion. So the background, to give the background, that my idea of true inclusion requires this centering requires diversity. And this is the quotation I'd like. If the material tells you it may be this, allow that. Don't turn it aside and call it an exception, an aberration, a contaminant. That's what's happened all the way along with so many good clues. The important thing is to develop the capacity to see one kernel of maize that is different and make that understandable. If something doesn't fit, there is a reason, and you find out what it is. So I'll finally talk about my own idea, which I'm calling centering, and writing it like this. This is my work over the more than a decade, emphasizes on centering, a process of continuous shifting of the center of knowledge making. Centering can be achieved through questioning normativity. It gives rise to new epistemologies. We've already talked about that. And most representative of the theoretical framework can be found in a later paper, new paper, but my paper in 2021. The title of the paper is Are We All Alike? Okay, how to understand this even more simply? I have a set example which I have used, I think, 2-3 talks before, and that's a platypus example. Okay, now this is how, I don't have to tell you people how a platypus looks. I think you're familiar with this, but none of us are familiar with this. We don't find this in our part of the world and in many other parts of the world. In fact, it is very odd creature, because and Aboriginal stories in Australia feature in platypus in a major way, and it has filtered through to English, some nursery rhyme and old stories. So they have, they are part mammal because they have fur, okay, and they lactate, and they are part reptile because they lay eggs, right, and they produce venom, and as you can see, they're part bird because they have a bill and they have webbed feet. Okay, they're also part shark, apparently, the way they catch their prey through something called electroception. I don't know how this is done. In fact, in 1799, this was brought to the shores of England, and people thought it's a hoax. It's not really something natural. But now, okay, imagine a teacher teaching, encountering this animal in a nursery rhyme or in a short story. How is she going to deal with it? Well, when with the kids who are not at all familiar with this, never seen something like this, right? She's going to draw something on the board. Okay, she's going to project a picture of it. Okay, maybe a video, etc. That's fine. But now imagine a blind child walking into the classroom. What is she going to do? Okay, the teacher is not imaginative and been teaching for years and knows the system inside out, doesn't care, and teaches in the same way. But there is this innovative teacher who knows that this is going to come tomorrow's class and I'm better prepared for today. And she prepares imperfect kind of model with whatever she has at her home, okay, with cardboards and things like that, which more or less replicates how a platypus looks like. Next day in the class, she passes it around. And of course, the blind child with tactile experience, able to understand what a platypus is. But more importantly, all these children with vision, they're going to also handle this toy platypus. And they're going to remember, this is my prediction, there is no longitudinal study for 20 years. In 20 years later, when they're teaching their kids what a platypus is, staying in the same environment, they're going to remember what a platypus is much better than they would have if they had been shown this picture on the board, right? So that's been shown in disability studies anyway. So in fact, in 1970s, 1980s, there was a change of policy, classroom teaching education policy in Britain and in London, and some of the schools were chosen to pick up this new ways of teaching, addressing some persons with disability. And there was this borough in London. It's a very poor black neighborhood borough, and they were doing very badly in this school, which is a government school. And they adopted this policy because there was some funding gain by adopting this policy. So they willingly accepted this policy, and within like 5 years of adopting this new policy of teaching, where you address all children, all sectors of groups of children, that school became one of the top schools nationally in England. Okay, so this is proven. It's been written about. So we always think that if we do some kind of adjustment, this disabled child is going to benefit. No, the bigger point is that everybody else is going to benefit as well. Okay, so this is where an epistemology is created. I told you about sign language earlier. Like if we look at language from sign language perspective, I get to gain a clarification of how to study language. So this is about this new epistemology. Once I focus on this,
want to understand what did the Baroda school do?
They adopted this new teaching policy, which is disability oriented. It was not so loudly disability oriented at that time. This was late 70s, and but it was about more inclusive practices. So there are certain funding gain if you adopt this. So they sort of took it up, and it immediately improved the standard of the school, their performance in the results. Yeah, so this is, if you remember this platypus, you will know what I really been talking about. So now the new proposal, which is for the first time I'm doing this. By the way, this paper is to be published, not yet published, and this is a turn in my own thinking. And this is the first time I'm doing a presentation on this talk. So you're the first audience that I'm trying this on. I'm calling it still integration. I'm in fact trying to shed off the negativity associated with the term integration. In disability studies, it becomes very clear at the beginning that it's not integration we're trying for. That has been tried and it's been shown to fail. We're trying for inclusion. Okay, but I want to go back to integration. Okay, because from the perspective that I'm looking at, I'm calling it contextual integration. There are certain features of this. One is this model inclusion, the inclusion that I have been talking about for last 12 years or so, should be our distant goal, but C integration or contextual integration is our immediate goal. It involves expanding and in some cases redrawing the existing boundaries. It is marked by the emergence of an interactive space for mutual enrichment. It is constantly evolving and is transformative, redefining each other and defining the system. So nothing is like transitory and written in stone. It has all the four features of Southern epistemology, which, just to remind you, anti-coloniality, economic viability, sustainability, and flexibility. And it leads to what non-theoretically I call in this paper as innovation through informality. And this is where we will open integration to re-examination. There's a more detailed work informing this, but I congratulate myself to be able to come up with a diagram to show you this yesterday. And I have this diagram. So this is the situation. There is something like a host, those X's, and as you can see, if you align them, there is a space available. And there is this, let's say, quote unquote guest. So this is my example of the blind child walking into the classroom. And there is a question mark, how to resolve this, right? So there are three types of ways you can go about, and I won't again go in detail, and that's why they're very light in color. That's not important for this talk. There is no boundary expansion kind of. Those are true integration, where totalizing is like this triangle goes into the circle and becomes a X. So that's totalizing. You take the blind child, but you don't look at their blindness. You just continue teaching the way you want to. Then retrofitting, okay, some kind of accessory, some kind of device. So it's like a device which is trying to make the blind child, the triangle, more like the X. And then you can also do boundary expansion, which are temporary. We already talked about sharing meal times or play times, periodic events like once a week you meet up, etc. Those are temporary. What we're interested in a boundary expansion, which is permanent. And there, these two things feature, and we're interested in C integration, where there is an interactive space. And this is the diagram. Same host, guest, and here's an interactive space. That's important. And the boundaries are not, let's say, don't take me literally, but not in dotted lines, but solid lines. That means it's a permanent boundary expansion. And ideally, take too long to figure this out, how to remove this boundary. But ideally, that's the thing which is going to go, and we have a redrawn boundary. And this is an interactive space where there is a mutual enrichment, right? So I'm taking a position slightly different from Fanon by saying there's a mutual enrichment. The person or the group which has gone to the periphery or a periphery-like position also gains new knowledge. Okay, so now finally we come to games. And how am I doing for time, Mohan? I'm not keeping track of it.
Will be 10 more minutes.
Okay, sure. Yeah, that's what I need. So so the claim is that traditional Indian games, or you can even say indigenous games, are naturally inclusive because they have what I am proposing, this kind of integration built into them, which means that they are informed by this Southern epistemology. The thing is that there's no study on this, very little study on traditional games certainly from this perspective, there's nothing. And traditional Indian games are cooperative acts, or traditional indigenous games are cooperative acts to achieve collective goals, which have been looked at, but they looked at something like, aspects which don't lend themselves easily to disability perspective. For example, improvement of muscles in certain parts of the body, etc. So those studies are not really my focus. Other thing that I've noticed, and this is true for English as far as I know, and the Indian games, depending on the language, but I've looked at broadly Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, and some Bengali. The names themselves on surface are biased, okay? But the games aren't. That's the point I'm making. So there is this, the tag games, they have this prejudice built in. For example, one game is called, I think most of you present here might be familiar, Langri Tang. Langri Tang means, Tang is leg, Langri is crippled, feminine of crippled, okay? So crippled leg. And then something like I'll talk about here, show you a video as well, called Lagri Pala. And in UP, Uttar Pradesh, the state bordering Delhi, it's called Langri Pala. So Langri is the same word for cripple, and Pala is turn. So crippled turn. Then this game that I'll show you, which we have looked at as a group also, Unch Neech Ka Papra. That is, Unch is high, Neech is low. So some kind of prejudice built in that. So assumption in all these games is the normative assumption is mobile and visual culture. Okay, so assumes a child who is able to move around. Tag games, chasing games, hopscotch, all these games assume a able child, and also somebody who can see, so with vision. Again, my inspiration for looking at this comes from Samir's another quotation from the same paper. Kids enjoy playing games like Pakram Pakrai, Lagri Pala, both variations of game tag, Chupan Chupai, hide and seek, Kho Kho, you've seen that already, and Oonch Neech. These would be games requiring a certain amount of physical fitness and normality for participation. However, I was included in playing most of them. More than my participation, I enjoyed seeing my co participants who could run faster than me. So, this is the spirit. This is a very nice way of looking at it from a disabled person's perspective that not only participated but actually enjoyed seeing others run better than do better than him. So, that whole idea when games change to sports of competition, of winning, is totally subverted here. Now, these games, excuse me, analysis of these games comes from a group discussion that we had, or talking about the games at least came from that. And my interest of doing this part of the talk is to highlight the experiential accounts of how disabled persons have experienced games in their childhood. This is a group, CDSI, Critical Disability Studies in India, is a reading group founded by me in 2010 with the explicit aim of highlighting disability knowledge by organizing readings and discussions. CDSI publishes the online journal, Indian Journal of Critical Disability Studies. I should be able to show you that. That's the one. There are 2 issues published in last year. And this is the first journal on critical disability studies. And then we have a couple of websites. I'll show you one website. Oops, sorry. This is a very old website from 2010. And this gives you information about the group. And Samir is an Indian disability studies scholar with cerebral palsy who is also an active member of the group. And he might be attending online. I'm not sure, it's too early in the morning in India. At present, completing a PhD in disability studies from a premier university in Delhi, that is JNU. We had this meeting, the 39th meeting of the group, held on 28th October 2018. The participants whose opinions I'll make use of regarding their games experience are Abhishek Thakur, Samir Chaturvedi, Sharmishta Atreja, Vageshwari Atreja, and Yogesh Yadav. All the members are disability studies scholars at the university, PhD scholars and or assistant professors. I won't put their names down on here except Chaturvedi because I've extensively quoted him. But in the published version, all these names are there after taking their permission, of course. Now, there are 2 things that I would like to talk about at the end, which makes this traditional games as inclusive and therefore pre-colonial in that sense. So one is the notion of safe zones. And I'll show you the little video. Look for this. Yeah, this is the one. This is Lagripala. This is also called Stapu in North India. And people would have played this, I'm sure. Yeah, this is a bit of a problem. Okay, I have to look for the cursor. It's a hopscotch game. It's called Stapu in North India and also West India.
It's called Kit.
Yeah. Yeah. Many of you would have played this game. Unfortunately, it's not played anymore. Not in the cities, at least. So Lagri Pala, because you have to assume the crippled position, and it is your turn. So okay, so that's the idea, and yeah. So the normative is this chasing and taking games. Usually, this normative for this game, Lagri Pala, also is the naming itself, Lagri Pala. And Stapu, I don't know where it came from. I did some research, but I couldn't figure it out. But the C integration, contextual integration interpretation will be that for a mobility disabled child, there will be a modification in the rules of the games where this jumping will not be required. Okay, and there are various details of that. And let's say if it's a blind child, then the location of the little flat stone which you have to pick up on your way back, or that will be actually spoken out loud, so that she or he would know where that thing is. Interestingly, for a blind child, the lines drawing these 9 squares or 8 squares, so there's a variation, will be they can use ropes easily available on the streets or anywhere in villages, or they can dug out the parts. So with that, a blind child hopping over these will be able to figure out the boundaries of the squares. So these are the ways that these children were accommodated. And in chasing games, tag games also, it assumes a normative where excludes the weaker or disabled child. And C integration, reading of 4 games I'll talk about. One is Uthali. This is actually talked about by American scholar Brewster in 1951 in a folklore journal, which is played in Maharashtra, where if you feel tired, you just sit down, right? And if you don't want to chase anymore, then somebody else takes that. And next, when you're ready, you make some sign, and then somebody taps on your shoulder and says "Uthali." Uthali means get up, right? And then they will run and become the chaser. Similarly, this is also Brewster talks about it, Limbi Pipali. So if you are like tired or you don't want to be, you want to escape being tagged, you climb trees. These are trees. So Limbi Pipali are trees, people trees and neem trees. In English, you have this old game. Again, these are not played at all, which is called Tricky Touchwood. And I tried to figure out what are these expressions, what do they mean, where they came from, whether Gaelic or Irish, but I couldn't figure this out. So if you want to not to be tagged for whatever reason, tired or you can't run anymore, you say Abarla. And when you're ready again, you say Ma Barla Ut. So this is American game called hang tag, both feet off the ground. If you jump, then okay, you are cannot be touched anymore. So I think these are very flexible, and these are built in as part of the game. Then nobody makes a big deal about it. So let me show you the last game that I have videos for, or I wanted to show, which is this called Unch Neech Ka Papra. I'll talk about that. Can you tell me what is the start?
Keep going on the left.
Okay. No, it's not changing, right?
No.
Yeah, this one. Right. It's all from the same source. It's open source, and I will give acknowledgement at the end. Unch Neech Ka. Unch is high, Neech is low. So the idea is this high ground. It's supposed to be the high ground. You can put anything. Papra is actually bark of a tree, because that's what you get. You don't get these carpets and clothing. These are city kids. This is for the filming of this. So they're in an apartment block. But you ask the chaser. One person is chosen as the chaser, and you ask the chaser, "Do you want high or low?" And all kids will say, "Let's say high," which means anybody who is on the higher surface can be chased by him, by them, by the chaser. Otherwise, they have to go. So see, they're maintaining the high position because she asked for low. So that's how the game is. Ooch Neech Ka Papra. And you have this. There is also a game called Touch in English. Again, earlier century, I think it disappeared in last century also. Most of these games have this something called counting out rhyme, which is I think still played in many countries. How you choose the chaser is by counting out. The one person remaining at the end becomes the chaser. Now, as it happens, the analysis of this English game shows that this the one who is counted or left, at the end is somehow tabooed in some way. Either he or she is weaker, or quote unquote, look wise odd, and it's not the normative, or disabled, whatever it is or was. That's the usual idea. So again, you have a normative where you have this counting out, trying to choose a. In India, North India, for this game, the chaser is called denner. So I have written about this word, why denner. It sounds like an English word, but I'm sure it's not an English word, and something to do with den maybe. Who is das? Unch mangi neech. Do you want high or low? And the C integration interpretation of this disabled child is never chosen as a denner. Okay. And then there's this interesting concept of kachi mitti. The name again is biased, unripe soil or unripe earth. Okay, unripe gives you connotations which are kind of biased in the context of a disabled child or a weak child. So the normative is biased naming, but it's actually the purpose of this that the denner is not allowed to go in that area. So you choose a kachi mitti area, which is the unripe soil area, and you jump over there or go and sit there. The chaser cannot not allowed to touch you. Okay, so these are very flexible. And the second and the last thing that I will talk about, how it may say inclusion through innovation. There is a game, again, there are videos of this, but I don't want to. You got the idea already. Pakram pakrai, to catch and catching. Normatic is chasing, as the ability must be there. But the C integration interpretation is noise as a guide, according to the group members. Noise as a guide to identity and location. Okay, so everybody out shouts, running out, and for a blind child, it's very easy to figure out the identity, who is shouting and where this person is, how far from me, etc. And but if you're playing this inside the classroom, then it is silently played because you're familiar with the furniture in the classroom. The schools where you don't move around furniture frequently, you're familiar with the setup, and there you don't really shout. So then this chupam chupai, hide and hiding, and there is a blindfolded version of that which is called Ankh Micholi. You do blindfolding. The normative is against biased naming, but the C integration is against sound or mobility or slow counting. To be able to include a mobility disabled child, you do slow counting or counting to a higher number so that they get the head start to run. And Coco, one member said, Coco players, the players, the 8 players sitting and one chaser you saw, they make noise. While sitting, they make noise. So for a blind child, it's easy to figure out where they are. These are actually experiential accounts. They're not made up. And all these people, the members who have gone through playing this in the childhood. And so I'm ready to conclude. And I show that exclusion is a major project of post-colonialism, and the near death of traditional Indian games or indigenous games is due to the persisting effects of post-colonialism, especially the change from games to sports. The modern games are exclusionary by way of exercising domination and power through aggression. There's been a lot of studies on this, how aggression shows up in school playground. and as a result, the disabled child is re-minoritized in these games. The two way of decolonizing I proposed is transformation of games to sports and model inclusion are suggested to be revival and a renewal of pre-colonial scene and contextual integration. So I'm going against this and model inclusion and saying we should adopt something like contextual integration from the position that I'm looking at, right? Because the Southern epistemology informs this flexibility, adjustment, something which is sustainable, something which is economically viable. All these examples I've shown you, you have a little piece of wood and you just rename a place or you change the rules, okay? And these are all possible if it remains as games, okay? Both these ways out of condition of subordination highlight the structurally integral feature of inclusion that is inherent in traditional Indian games. The two ways in which traditional games imbue inclusion are the concept of safety zones or safe zones and inclusion through innovation or flexibility. The references, this is the attribution for the videos. So there's the source, which is it's part of a government project and it's open source, and also IIT Mumbai who have produced this. These are the references. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanmoy. Let's open up the floor to questions.
Question. The center initially you talked about, that center keep moving. So in this case, if you relate it with this, the games that we're talking about changing. So again, that means it will have multiple centers or are they linked, or is it just spiraling up something that from a center to and changing the games?
No. The idea is that centering is required as a decolonization process once you have this sports side. But once you have games, which these traditional games are, they are already inclusive. So then there is no, because there is no group who get preference, or there's no one child who's given preference. They try to include everybody, and the idea is not about one person or two persons winning. So centering would not be required for this. But for a sports event, if you want to subvert that, which sort of destroys the idea of sports itself, meaning there one would say that change the rules so that some people starting late will be given kind of preference.
So this inclusive one and like innovation along with the normal children, also disabled children, we do just only some modifications.
Yeah, it is just an empirical evidence to pick up these traditional games to show that they were much more inclusive because they were flexible. You could do this kind of adjustments, and that is what is required for at least a part of the world, the southern part of the world, or parts of southern part of northern world also, where sustainability and economic viability and anti-coloniality are important. So I think that's a reason to look for it. This kind of evidence to show that it can be done. It has a format already.
Okay, may I ask you a question? I'm not sure whether it is relevant to your talk, but it's my curiosity.
Sure.
The question is, as a linguist, as you are, what sort of speech and language therapy can be provided to the speech impaired and mentally disturbed children under 5 and above of the underprivileged classes?
Yeah, this is not directly from my talk, and this is, as you know, perhaps that is a huge field of work, practice and theory also, and there are several ways of looking at it. The way I would look at these attempts as from a disability studies perspective would be to be able to not have this normative, right? And that has been done over the years and still being done. Many special education centers, not just in South Asia, but many parts of the world, especially with, let's say, deaf kids or, as you said, speech impaired, different categories, of course, where there is a, the situation in India, I can tell you, that you have on paper, you have a special educator for most of the government schools. Now, special education educator is this one person who has got this permanent job, and he or she is supposed to be expert on all kinds of disabilities. Okay, so that's not possible, first of all. One person will cater for a blind child, or a deaf child, a mobility impaired child, or neurocognitive impaired child. This is not possible. These are separate disabilities requiring different kinds of solutions and trainings. So, for example, the platypus picture that you had, I could have problematized it by saying, now suppose a deaf child is there in your class. So what do you do as an innovative teacher? So these require very specific adjustment, very specific body of knowledge. And that's totally ignored. Secondly, their aim, as comes to, let's say, speech impaired deaf student, their aim is to give speech training. And I have been, going hoarse, shouting for 30 years, 20 years, saying that this is completely meaningless. It's as equivalent as trying to make the blind person see, or the dark person in white, something like that. So it is completely failed project to start with. It was done everywhere, France and England, everywhere. But I think people learned, and there are other ways. So idea, disability studies perspective would say that it's not a big deal that you're able to speak. In fact, in my work on sign language, I've shown sign language or signs. Sign language is actually much more, quote unquote, non-theoretical term, expressive, because I can do simultaneous things, which I can't do in speech. Speech is limited. In fact, I would use the word handicap, disabled, by the limitation restriction of one sound at one time. Okay, sound at a time. You can't do more than one sound at one time, right? But I can do 2, 3 things in sign language. I can, just do this with my torso. I can bend down. I have to bend down if I want to ask a question, right? And I'm also doing this space I told you already. Okay, the long back is higher up at the back, at least in Indian sign language. And yesterday would be like this, right? So I'm playing with the space, the dimensionality of the space, the visuality of the space. I'm also giving meaning, let's say the question intonation, by bending my upper torso, which I can't do in this thing. I can't do in speech. So it is multidimensional because different modality is not restricted by the physics of speech as sound. So that way it can be more expressive, quote unquote, more expressive. I never use that term, but just to make you see the point. So, so we're not even going there. We're saying that it is possible to have this as a representation of human existence, a deaf child in my classroom. I don't have to make that deaf child non-deaf or give 20 years of speech training. Now, when it becomes a very specific topic, like there are gradations of speech impairment, where because of the educational force, because of the kind of epistemological force that we have been subjugated under, there have been early childhood educationists and training programs, which showed if you sit down to analyze, the percentage of success is very minimal. But they went on and still goes on and goes on training. So there are certain things which are, the training is, the whole idea of imposing this training is because of the belief that there is only one normative that you should be able to speak. And in a country like ours, there are other things like it should be, he should be able to get a job, he should be able to study this, acquire these qualifications, etc. So it's not going to work for many more years to come. But I think the idea to start with is that this is a equal being. Okay, not able to speak is not able to speak. He's just doing. In fact, I said that he can do more than speak.
Thank you. We know all these policies, but we don't know how to send all this policy across the,
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree with you.
especially
I agree with you, but I think the
especially in New Zealand, Maori people.
Mhm.
Because they never get the opportunity. All the theories, all the policy makers, they are giving different theories, but it doesn't go
I know.
across
I
the
know. So I know. I think that's why work is very important. We work with the community. We work with the disabled. I've been disabled population. As I said in the introduction, we introduced many courses. I introduced many courses in the center, um, and that's how we work with the community. Hope that some of these mindset changes take
For
place.
example, there was a boy, I noticed he mentally disabled.
No, I think it is that simplistic terms are not very, accurate in that sense. But the idea is that the this is the model inclusion I'm talking about. It's a model,
Yeah.
and what I said today is that should be our goal anyway, model inclusion. But our immediate goal, given the other issues, like some of the issues that you're talking about, economics is one such issue, and other ways of being disabled. So that's a very loaded term. It's not me, but the society makes me disabled. So for that reason, I'm suggesting this contextual integration. I'm not saying it's a temporary workable solution, but I think, in fact, my idea of true inclusion, which is centering, can be achieved I forgot to mention this, but most effectively through this contextual integration. Otherwise, the point, otherwise, what you're saying is correct, that there is this theoretical model and there is this practical issues where these theory ideas have not been implemented, right? So that's one way out would be what I'm suggesting, that you don't have to hold on to the model inclusion. You can do better centering through this contextual integration. Integration need not be a bad word. And that I already prefaced it by saying it's a new turn in my work. And I'll see how it goes.
Professor Bhattacharya, I have to apologize. My car parking meter outside.
Oh.
And I'll make an observation and I'll leave. Consider that to be rude.
Sure.
I enjoyed your talk. It's diverse. It's not linguistics, although I have elements of it. You mentioned three things that are bring together. One is decolonization, one is social integration, including fitting in, and the other is subaltern. One thing that I observe when I go back to India these days, many years now, that the urban middle class parents send their children to English medium schools who do not learn to speak even their mother tongue properly, let alone write, and the parents are not ashamed of it. One of the things that colonialism did to every country was to make the colonized learn to hate their own culture. That's the worst thing that it has done. Now I observe that the English-speaking, English medium taught kids and the lower middle class of the rural area where the English medium schools are not there, or even if they're there, they're not really taught by English speaking people. They feel outside it. So they become a new recolonized subaltern specimen. This is something that's sort of serious and not much of a concern about it. India is a multilingual country. So in urban areas other than English, in Bengal, for example, Hindi speaking. So our kids coming back from school, they can speak Hindi, they can speak English, and the fact that they cannot speak Bengali very well is of no concern to anybody. So observe that as a linguist. You probably have some ideas about it. I hope to meet you again sometime.
Sure.
To discuss it.
And thank you for your observation. I have a lot of ideas about it, but they want to talk about it because they want.
So,
And there's a question.
I think many things you said are very complex and difficult, I think, for 99% of the population to comprehend. Difficult for me to comprehend in many ways. But I think there are several key concepts that seem to stand out. First of all, the sort of concepts and what is meant by inclusion is a very big thing. Not everybody fully understands it, and yet people think we do. The other concept that kind of marries with it in a strange way are the assumptions of what is meant by democracy. So what I'm thinking, and then of course you mentioned normalization. What is normalization? You know, who is it? What is it? How does it apply? So is it the case that inclusion is a part of or a principle within democracy, or some kind of new democracy? And how does that affect the assumptions of what is considered to be normal, if that's something that moves forwards? Yeah. So it's that assumption of where is the marriage between the ideas of democracy and inclusion, and how does that impact on society?
Yeah, I think it's a very big topic, and perhaps too briefly, I'll have to mention that democracy, just democratic principles will never make you achieve this kind of true inclusion that I'm talking about. Because democracy for a small group, okay, is different from democracy for how a democratic principle applies in a bigger group. For a small group, I can include everybody. I have 10 students, I can include everybody because I'm having this party at home, I'm not leaving anybody out. But suppose I have like 1,000 students, okay? Then I use the democratic principle, okay? 60 of them, 70 of them can come on, or 600 of them can come on Friday evening, okay? 400 of them cannot come on Friday evening, they have other things. I do not have time to go and ask those 400 what are exactly your problems and can we sort it out. I just move along and hold the event on a Friday evening because the majority is coming. And that's a democratic way. It's not being dictatorial, it's not being rude, and that's what we go about doing in this kind of gatherings, classrooms, political systems, etc. So that's not going to cut with this kind of inclusion. So I don't know whether it's for a new democracy, but certainly it's not a derivative of a democratic ideal. So it's not, it doesn't talk with democracy. Ideally it should. Maybe it is possible to change democracy to that extent. But I think if we change democracy to that extent where it becomes truly inclusive, it doesn't remain democratic anymore because it violates certain operational principles of democracy, if not the main philosophy of democracy. So I think that's not a yardstick for true inclusion. True inclusion is, it sounds like a big topic when Shraddha was asking this question about implementation with the sectorial group or in education. But I think true inclusion we can understand from our own personal investments. Okay, and I don't have to specify certain little topic for anybody. They can take this example from their own, attitudes towards, let's say, family members. Forget about politics and country and nation state, etc. To their relatives, to their own children, etc. So I think, as I've spoken about this in an undergraduate college last year, that it is a way of being, and that's why I said when I specified my location, that is very much part of my being. Okay, I'm not going to shout it out as I am inclusive and you're not, like that, but it is my way of operating. And so, in order to understand that, we have to understand from that perspective first, I think, instead of, let's say, a political system. But the implementation issues are problematic, and there are other people who can do a better job than me in doing that.
I had a couple of questions.
Sure.
The first is it's just beautiful to see how you sort of this idea of contextual integration goes from the micro to macro, in the sense that you're really talking about a micro way of reorganizing, but that has macro level implications. The question I have is regarding the concept pre-colonial.
Yes.
That in itself is a political concept when you think about India, and particularly when you think about the politics of caste, feudalism, in terms of what really makes up pre-colonial and reference to pre-colonial and post-colonial India.
Right.
So I would love to hear your thoughts on how you grapple with that and theorizing that, particularly in terms of conceptualizing the inequalities that are built into the imaginary of the people.
Yes. So this is a very important question, and this is what I hinted at the beginning when I read out the title of my talk. That there are concepts which I will not and only vaguely talk about, because there's an obvious question. The first question that comes out is that why pre-colonial? Because these members of my team, they are graduate students. They're not playing these games during the pre-colonial time. But what I'm trying to say is that these are pre-colonial, conceptually pre-colonial. They're conceived, of course, the British games that I looked at, and there's luckily very good, this is a little book by Gomes, 2 volumes, big volumes, and they've documented most of the games, Scotland, Ireland, of 19th century onwards, up to, I think this book was published in 1950s, these 2 volumes. So it's excellent. We have nothing comparable. So they are definitely located in the pre-colonial times. But more importantly, as you correctly asked this question, why pre-colonial? What I'm saying is that this is conceptually, it is that pre-colonial form in terms of this. I'm not into these rules which sports brings in. All games have some rules, but as children, all of us grew up by saying, okay, let's do this. Okay, when we play with our siblings, we say, okay, let's do this. There's a staircase, let's do this. Right? We keep on changing and bending rules all the time. And that's a more inclusive way of playing, I would say. And so conceptually, it is pre-colonial because the pressure of rules, that Fanon said, one way that the centered, for in our language, centered, culturally centered, or the centered person or group have to make sense of this centering is to how to overcome the rules imposed on them, on their body, territory, and mind. Okay, so these rules is more important. So here I'm taking a metaphor of that rule in the context of games, but it is much bigger concept, as you know very well. So how to subvert that whole idea of rule? These rules are not, for me. There have been big epistemological monolithic structures to show that it is important to have justice. It is important to have reason. It is important to have organized society. But what it has shoved under by creating these rules in order to have this is a very post-colonial project. And that's why pre-colonial from that point. The rule as a metaphor, that I'm ignoring the rule. I'm making new rules all the time. I'm flexible. And that also suits my economy. I'm making this as a sustainable effort. I'm making it as doable. I have a little board there. I put it over there. I say, okay, this is the high ground. You have to, if we escape the chaser, you have to just jump on that. So children make these games all the time. So temporally, it's not strictly pre-colonial, except that these games originated in the pre-colonial times. But I think I'm more interested in the pre-colonial concept of rules being a very, not a fixed concept. Having rules is not a very fixed concept.
Connected to that then is the next question, which is, when you are doing your intervention kind of work in terms of policy and framing interventions within a broader landscape of education, say for instance,
Hmm.
how do you grapple with bringing in these theoretical concepts which are really important into the interactions with activists, communities, policymakers?
Hmm. I think one way I can think of, and we need to talk about this more later. One way we can think of is to, at a very practical level, to identify or or at least re-evaluate the value ascription, re-evaluate that value ascription to certain part of, let's say, a child's schooling or the education system. Okay, so that should not be fixed. That should be context dependent. But I think there is no one way. Okay, this sports is good for you, for your health, for your mind, for your body, and for your general education. We need to re-examine that. So this is one way of going, trying to take this paraphernalia of education and re-examine each of this from this context. Oh, really? Is it really beneficial? Can you show me exactly how? Can I teach this? Because this is an idea accepted by everybody. The headmaster will accept it, and we must have this competition, we must have this game. But has anybody evaluated the kind of damage it would have done as well? And that's why the psychology is important. The psychological extension is important. For a child who is not able to participate, forget about winning, what kind of damage it does to their becoming, their being. So, can we rethink the idea that sports in general, competition in general, is good for the development of the child? This is a development model. The whole post-colonial idea is a development model. So, this is development in that sense. So, that's the idea.
Any other remaining questions before we wrap up? Okay, if not, we want to thank you so much,
Thank you.
Namrata, for this conversation. It's been a pleasure to have you with us, and thank you to our audience who joined us online for joining us. And you can keep watching this video that will be on the YouTube and Facebook platforms.
Is there any online question?
Do we have any online questions? Just some audience.
Comments.
Comments? Do you want to read any? I don't see any questions. online. Okay.
Okay.
There are actually questions on the YouTube platform, I think, a couple of comments. One comment is from Ramakant Abhinoti. Said, is your idea of multilinguality very different from mine?
Mhm. It is not at all very different, but it is different in the sense that any multiple uh, human human existence, I'm taking as multilingual. That's what I prefaced my comment on this by saying that I will not get into it. But being multilingual doesn't really mean doesn't really talk about multiple languages, but it is a way of being. Because, like Ramakant himself has said, multilinguality is constitutive of human existence. And I think he has said it, but I will underline that further by saying that multilinguality also doesn't mean multiple recognized languages. You might be speaking English to your child, but you are speaking, two of you, and maybe three of you, four of you. All these are different varieties. One person speaking to the child also might be multiple varieties at different times, different registers. So multilinguality, technically, I see it that way, and that's the the becoming of the child. It's not about language. It is about to be able to deal with multidimensionality. So that's what I'm keeping the term multilinguality, but I don't mean multiple languages at all. So if that matches with Professor Agnihotri's idea, he is the first one to have proposed this, and then we are talking about the same thing. But definitely, I'm talking about the same thing with certain additions.
He's also said, thank you for this theoretically dense paper, rising out of our past meetings. And good to see you talk about multilinguality and city integration. Samir Chaturvedi has said, I'm here, awesome paper.
Mhm.
I think that's it.
Okay.
Ramana.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much for this presentation. And once again, thank you all for joining us.
And a round of applause.
Yes.
Very good.
Thank you.
For organizing this.
Yeah.